Minister, the focus of a recent motion on disability services was to call for the HSE to stop using the standard operating procedure, which involved the carrying out of preliminary team assessments and implying to parents of children with disabilities and additional needs that this was fulfilling the statutory right of a child to a full and proper assessment of need. We indicated that this was not the case and that the HSE must stop trying to evade their obligations under the Disability Act of 2005. Our call has been further vindicated by the recent High Court ruling in CTM versus HSE and JA versus HSE, which found that the standard operating procedure adapted by the HSE in 2020 was causing its assessment officers to err in law. I welcome the fact that the HSE do not intend to appeal this case, but urgent measures must be taken to ensure that all children with disabilities are getting access to a proper and comprehensive assessment of need, which would identify the nature and extent of disability and the corresponding level of service needed. Children are entitled to this assessment within a period of 6 months from when they first apply, with an additional month to allow for a service statement to be drawn up, which will outline the precise services and interventions that they will require going forward to address their disability or additional need. There is a serious problem among the 91 Children's Disability Network teams, where it seems that none of them are fully staffed, and in fact many are operating on a 50 to 60% staffing level. Even if the staffing level was at 100% of the level currently resourced, it has been relayed to me by numerous staff within the CDNTs, including management, that this would still not be sufficient to meet the level of need among children requiring assessment and services. Parents are very aware of this, with one parent responding to a survey from Down Syndrome Ireland saying that there are not enough therapists to deal with increased numbers. There are already a major shortage, and now their client load will be completely unmanageable. It is this shortfall in staff and resources that has led to the long delays that parents of children with disabilities face, the extent of which is reflected in a recent report from Inclusion Ireland, which states that many parents reported that their child spent a significant time on a waiting list for services. 85% reported that they'd waited or continued to wait for more than a year. And of these children, 27% were waiting 2 to 4 years, 16% were waiting 4 to 6 years, and 5% for 6 or more. We need to see a fully costed implementation strategy and a strategic workforce development plan within a specific time frame, indicating precisely how the shortfalls in the disability sector are going to be addressed. There are huge problems within the recruitment procedures for therapists and clinicians to the disability network teams. The recruitment system to me seems archaic and takes an inordinate amount of time to actively recruit someone to a position. We need to see an end to the national panels and instead look at recruitment on a regional basis within a very short space of time. Many therapists have left this sector as they would not and could not agree to the preliminary team assessments. Now that the High Court ruling means that this practice must cease, perhaps some of those who left could be enticed back to the sector if offered positions at suitable grades. The disability sector is receiving bad press due to the preliminary team assessment and the long waiting lists that are ever growing for assessments and therapies. And this was reflected recently in a survey conducted by As I Am, which found that 54% felt very dissatisfied with the support services from the HSE for their autistic children, with as many as 65% of respondents going on to express dissatisfaction within broader disability services. This, in my opinion, is unfair on the very dedicated staff working within the disability sector, where teams are understaffed and under-resourced to carry out the tasks that they have been set. This negative publicity has become so bad that people are reluctant to work in this sector, and this must be addressed. The blame for this lies entirely with government policy, with years of neglect of this sector. There is need for a long-term plan to address this and ensure that Children's Disability Network teams are fully staffed and fully resourced in the years to come. I am very concerned about the children who require interventions and therapies now, as early intervention is vital for children to progress in life, and for many who do not receive the early intervention means they cannot progress to be the best version of themselves and will require more interventions and supports in later life, meaning that they will be less able to lead a fully active and independent life. The Government needs to look at urgent measures to address the immediate requirements within the sector to ensure that all children's needs are met.
Thank you, Deputy Tully.
Can I thank Sinn Féin and Deputy Tully for tabling the motion, and indeed can I thank all colleagues around the House for their contributions this evening. Minister Rabbitte wanted to be here this evening, and she apologises for her absence. As Minister Rabbitte said in the House, I think it was 3 weeks ago to the day, the matters we're discussing and the matters that are being raised in the PMB, they're hugely important, and they require a ruthless focus and a very ambitious focus on our health services and on the implementation of progressing disability services for children. But there is considerable work to do. I have made very similar contributions on the other side of the House that I've heard made today. One of the many reasons I asked to be Minister for Health in the incoming government was to be able to provide funding and focus and resource for children who need help. It is simply not acceptable in our republic that children would have to wait for assessment of needs, and it is simply not acceptable that, having been assessed and assessed as needing help, that they would have to wait any length of time. We all have friends, we all have family, we all know children who need these services, and we all know how important the services are, and we all know how important it is that the children get these services as quickly as possible. And while some areas of the country are doing very well, particularly in some therapeutic areas, the reality is that far too many simply are not. And we are going to have to redouble our efforts. We have invested the money. We invested the money in assessment. We've invested the money in hiring the therapists. Minister Rabbitte, I can assure the House, has worked tirelessly on this issue. She has driven around the country since she was appointed, meeting CHO by CHO, meeting therapeutic team after therapeutic team, and saying, what do you need? What money do you need? What staff do you need? What are the barriers to hiring the staff? I've had many of the same conversations myself. But we all know that there is, unfortunately, still a long way to go. The money has been invested, and the national network, the policy, it's not perfect, but the Progressing Disability Services approach is a good approach. And I know there's a very good relationship between Minister Rabbitte, between the Oireachtas Committee, and between those of us in here who are really passionate about this area. And I'm going to address some of the technical issues and the court ruling and the PMB now, but I just wanted to say that there is a lot more that needs to be done. And we're all aware that in every single one of our constituencies, there are mums and dads with their kids who are desperate to get the therapies for their children, be it occupational therapy or psychology or speech and language or whatever it may be across the range of therapies. And we are not going to stop until we have made sure that the teams are in place at entry level and at senior level and at management level to make sure that when a kid gets an assessment, and that they get the right assessment and the appropriate assessment, when they are assessed for help, that they get that help. And none of us will stop, and I know no one across the House is going to stop until we achieve that. I want to acknowledge the content of the judgment that was issued by the High Court in relation to the standard operating procedure. I think it is important to state that the rationale under which the SOP was introduced, the overarching principle was to establish the needs of the children rather than providing a diagnosis. So it was about establishing needs, ensuring a quicker route to intervention services. The SOP was never intended to prevent or reduce children's access to their legal entitlements. The SOP was developed following a lot of engagement with expert stakeholders. There was extensive industrial relations process involved, and there was legal advice taken on it. And essentially, the SOP was agreed at the start of 2020, but I allocated money in towards the second half of 2020 to Minister Rabbitte to have as many children as possible assessed. We had this big backlog of children waiting for assessment. We needed to make sure as many got assessed as possible. And then, as has quite rightly been pointed out, well then, what about the therapies? And so what we did was we invested a very considerable amount of money in increasing the workforce. But as has been raised by colleagues here this evening, as has been raised by Minister Rabbitte, as has been raised by the HSE, it is currently challenging to hire, not just in children's disability services, but in acute services, in adult services, in primary care services right around the country. There's a lot of good things happening, and the money is there, and the posts have been sanctioned right across the board. We're hiring thousands and thousands of therapists, but it is a challenge, and it's a challenge we have to continue to work on. The court judgment puts the HSE in a position where obviously it has to now consider the assessment of need process. And I note the comments by Mr. Paul Reid in relation to the consideration of an appeal. I believe the judgment provides the state with an opportunity. We need to build on the elements of the process that work. We need to eliminate or amend the elements of the process that don't work. And I know Minister Rabbitte made similar comments 3 weeks ago. We do need to assess the full picture, and we need to gather a lot of information. And in this regard, I'm conscious of a case in the Court of Appeal that's expected shortly. There's an independent review of the standard operating procedure, which is already underway and is now being finalised. And the legal framework for the state, needless to say, that takes precedence, but I think it is prudent to gather as much other information as possible. The core of any future action has to be the delivery of service to children as quickly and as effectively as possible in line with the legislation. And while addressing the judgment of the courts, which is important and it has to be resolved, it is worth saying that the assessment of need is only one part of the service delivery. We're very determined to address the standard of the assessment of need, but we have to create a model that ensures that the therapies identified, as we were discussing this evening, can be delivered. So in that context, the HSE is consulting with the chief execs of the Section 38s, the Section 39s, the lead agencies and other stakeholders. In the meantime, the assessment of need will no longer be issued on the basis of a preliminary team assessment. So where appointments have been scheduled, these will form the first step in the assessment of need process. The initiatives mentioned in the House recently will continue to be developed, and as many colleagues will be aware, the initiatives include the development of the Parents Forum, and Minister Rabbitte has advised me that she intends to commence the countrywide forum next week. I believe she's starting in Cork, and a big focus for Minister Rabbitte will be on developing enhanced communication with parents seeking to build trust in the services provided. We need to listen very, very carefully to the parents. Beg your pardon, Deputy? Right. Yes, Minister Rabbitte is determined to get the rest of these up and running as quickly as possible. On staffing, there is ongoing recruitment of 375 personnel across the country. Now, just to give a sense of how challenging that has been, my figures won't be exact, but from a briefing note I read earlier this morning, I think about 1/3 of that target was met in the first year that that number was allocated, just to give colleagues a sense that the money is there, the posts have been sanctioned, but it is proving difficult to hire the therapists. Now, obviously, we are working on expanding the graduate positions and the number of graduates coming through as well. In addition to these actions, the Department has agreed to 1.5 million funding for approximately 1,000 ASD diagnostic assessments, and the HSE says that that initiative is now underway. And regardless of any process that the HSE considers to address the concerns over the standard operating protocol, the developments I've mentioned will enhance capacity of the Children's Disability Network teams, and it's expected that the measures will translate directly to enhancing services to the child and to his or her family. Regarding Section 13 reporting, which was raised as well, I can confirm the HSE has prepared and presented Section 13 annual reports for 2007 to 2014 to the Department of Health and is currently working on the annual reports for 2015 to 2020 to bring that process up to date. Now, the HSE intends to submit the outstanding reports by the end of the year, and both the HSE and officials in my department are scheduled to meet very shortly to discuss these details, to discuss these Section 13 reports in greater detail. Now, while the HSE has stated its experienced delays due to the cyber attack last year and has found limitations to the assessment officer system database, which was referenced earlier, the lack of reporting cannot be deemed to be acceptable. Minister Rabbitte has sought assurances on the nature of the statistics and has been advised that the delay has not impacted the HSE's calculation in establishing additional resources. So, Chair, I appreciate I'm out of time. So with your indulgence, can I just conclude by saying the following? I can assure this House and all colleagues that the Government is as determined and as committed as ever to providing timely access to high quality health and social care services for children and young people who need them. It includes an appropriate assessment, the right interventions, and as I said at the outset, what has happened now is an opportunity that we must grasp, and we must continue a relentless focus and an investment and a prioritisation to get these children the assessments they need and the therapeutic interventions and support they need following those assessments. Thank you.
First of all, I just want to thank all of those who contributed to this debate and for their support of the motion. I suppose all of us have children and families living in our constituencies who are waiting years for services, years for assessments. I'm hearing from parents who are getting letters telling them, we will see your child for an appointment in November 2024, or your child will be seen in 4 years' time. That's outrageous and has to be urgently addressed. I welcome the fact that the Government's not opposing this motion, but I'm wondering, can I assume that you are supporting the motion? And I'm going to reiterate what we are actually calling for in this motion. But just to mention very quickly there, you talked about the High Court ruling and the preliminary team assessment and the reason it was introduced. It was introduced to assess the needs of a child for the purpose of ensuring that they receive the therapies or interventions quickly. But that wasn't happening. They were getting this preliminary team assessment just to be put onto another waiting list for a proper, full assessment of needs, or for another waiting list for services and interventions. So just to go back, some people have talked about a review of the Disability Act, and I agree it should be reviewed to bring it into line with the UNCRPD and to ensure that it's based on a rights-based model. But it cannot be undermined, or the rights of children cannot be undermined or diluted in any way when reviewing that. In fact, it should be actually used to strengthen the rights of children to services and interventions. The database the HSE were using, and has been talked about here a few times by the assessment officers, by their own admission is outdated and not fit for purpose. That needs to be addressed urgently so that the reports that they are lacking, and you mentioned yourself that the reports up to 2014 were published, but since that they haven't been. So we are calling for the outstanding reports to actually be with the DAL. We are calling for them in the middle of the autumn sessions. We're looking for them in September, and we'll be coming back to that if they're not provided. We've also talked about engaging in proactive and joined-up workforce planning to develop a strategy to address the shortages of staff in all of the services here. So something maybe should be done to try and entice those healthcare and social care professionals who left the services because of their discomfort with the preliminary team assessment. And many of them stated that's why they left the services. So now that with the High Court ruling saying that those preliminary team assessments won't be continued, we should look and see, can they actually be enticed back to the services? Also, I'm hearing of problems with Curu and the amount of time it's taken for them to accredit the qualifications of people coming from the north to work in this state. It's taken up to 10 months. That is something that maybe could be looked at and addressed quite quickly. I think we need to be talking to children, not just in the third level colleges, but even in secondary school, about working in the sectors here and doing something to entice them into this sector. So maybe looking at a reduction in fees or a waiver in fees in those. But I think a job guarantee with a contract that ensures that those who do qualify in these areas do not export their skills and their knowledge is absolutely vital. We're also looking for a report, and we want this report before the summer, which will outline in full the number of whole-time equivalents that will receive actual jobs this year in 2022, and indeed what other supports are being given to the Children's Disability Network teams and other resources to address the backlog of assessments and proper assessments, and then actually to provide the therapies that they require. I mean, I think every effort needs to be made to ensure that these CNDTs are up and running in full capacity without delay. And you mentioned the family forums, and that's very important. Minister Burke made a reference to parents having to do training, and that this was, to support the therapies. Parents are not objecting to doing the training whatsoever, but they are objecting to doing it alone. The children are not receiving the therapies. And actually some parents have told me that they've been told, even though they've done the training already, they're being asked to do it again, and they're being told, if you don't, your child will be removed off the waiting list. And that is absolutely outrageous and should not be happening in any place. There's the ongoing disparity as well between Section 39 and the HSE. Those working for the HSE directly has to be addressed, because those agencies are just hemorrhaging staff to the HSE and they can't retain them in any form. So they need the same pay and the same working conditions. I also want to use this opportunity to call for the government to ratify the optional protocol of the UNCRPD, which is something that is still outstanding. And I suppose just to make a reference there that we've refugees coming in from other countries, especially we're expecting a large number from the Ukraine. Many of them may be qualified in these professions, and we need to look and see, can we engage those people and get them working here? They will have PPS numbers, they will be allowed to work. Let's get them into our teams to fill a need that's there. So thank you, Minister, and thank you, Chair.